So the old imperialism is really kind of talking about the American colonies, Spain, in Latin America, and places like that. So this is going to be the new imperialism. So new imperialism, at the end of the 18th century, imperialism appeared to be on the decline. Britain had lost most of its colonies in the Americas and in Spain and in Portugal, and Spain and Portugal had lost most of Latin America. 100 years later, the world witnessed a new wave of imperialism. So from the 1880s to the 1900s, almost every corner of the earth became claimed by European powers. Africa, for example, was suddenly divided up like a cake to be eaten by hungry European powers. And you can see that right here. Here's all the different places that were divided up in Africa. Uh, a lot of these places in Latin America are going to become independent, which we'll see later on. So causes of new imperialism. So new technological developments based on the Industrial Revolution made new imperialism possible. So the Industrial Revolution actually brought about these new inventions that made it easier for Europeans to go places they've never been before. So the steamboat made it possible to go upstream for the first time, reaching the interior of Africa and other places previously too difficult to reach. So they just left those places alone, but now they could get up into those different areas, and that way they could take weapons in there, colonists and things like that. The telegraph made it possible to communicate with new settlements deep in the interior regions of Africa and Asia. So, if there were problems in those areas, you could send a telegraph out and you could have the British troops show up. So, later imperial powers built railroads to ship goods and raw materials to and from their colonies. So, again, they're looking to make money off the raw materials from their colonies. So, new medicines like quinine that treated malaria and anesthetics uh, and a better understanding of disease made it possible to explore the tropical areas with less risk. So, what was happening to a lot of Europeans is they would go hot tropical areas, they would catch malaria and die, so they just couldn't go in there. So, they came up with these new medicines that actually allowed them to go into those places. So, military technology like rifles could be used to control local people, and kind of in this picture over here, which you see Zulu warriors from Africa fighting the British troops, fighting against rifles with spears and shields and things like that. All right, so causes of new imperialism, there were a lot of motives for imperialism. So new countries such as Belgium, Germany, and Italy wanted to be just as powerful as Britain and France. Even older colonial powers like France and Britain joined in the scramble, thinking that they were going to lose some of the territory. Britain seized control of Egypt to protect what was the Suez Canal, which was a huge deal, huge trade between Britain and India. Without Suez Canal, the trip would have to go all the way around Africa. So this provided the shortest route from Britain to India. European powers were also anxious to preserve the balance of power between themselves. They wanted to become powerful enough to be equals with Britain and France. So European powers hoped to obtain natural resources and other markets to sell their goods. So they wanted to take over areas that way they could sell their manufactured goods. Finally, imperialists like Kipling spoke of the white man's burden, the duty of Europeans to spread their culture to areas of Africa and Asia. So really the white man's burden is they thought they were so superior, which you see over here in this picture, but really in all these pictures, that it was their duty to go and civilize these different places. So in some places, your imperialists met with fierce local resistance, and the British fought wars in the Sudan. They fought wars in South Africa, and a lot of other places. So a lot of these places didn't just give up; they actually fought back against the British. So in this picture, what you see, the white man's burden, you see the British, which is always the redcoats. Up here is civilization, and they're actually carrying these groups, which is India, China, Japan. They're trying to carry them to civilization, acting like they needed to be saved. And then here's Uncle Sam coming in, and places like Cuba, the Philippines, they're doing the same thing. So areas that we took over, they're actually, trying to show that we're trying to civilize them. So reason for new interest in imperialism, technology, these new technologies like we just talked about, steamships, rifles, telegraph, and other medicines made it possible to get into places they had never been before in Africa and Asia. Political motives: Europeans wished to acquire colonies to demonstrate their power. European countries also sought to preserve the balance of power between all the European countries. When one country obtained a new colony, others thought they had to do the same to be equal. Economic motives: European industries needed raw materials to keep their factories busy. So imperialists sought new markets to sell their manufactured goods. And social motives: many Europeans believed in what was called social Darwinism, the theory that some societies were more successful because their cultures were superior. Other Europeans wanted to spread Christianity throughout the world. So, scramble for Africa. In the 1870s, Europeans still controlled very little actual territory in Africa. France had acquired Algeria in the northwest area, and Britain controlled South Africa. Otherwise, European activity was mainly limited to coastal cities and trading ports and things like that. So, communities in the interior of sub Saharan Africa still remain completely isolated, and they represented an immense diversity of cultures with many different types of political structures, mainly tribes. Over the next 20 years, this picture changed completely. So, European powers engaged in what's called the scramble for Africa. So, a short period of time, 20 years, where Europeans came in and just tried to take over all of Africa. And in the 1850s and 1860s, European explorers mapped out the interior of Africa for the first time with steamships. And you can see all these different areas that are controlled by all these different European. And really, the independent areas are going to be Ethiopia. Uh, and I think it looks like Liberia might have been the only other independent area in Africa. And of course, this is kind of how the British treated themselves in Africa. And then this is a drawing of tribal leaders kissing the boots of the British troops. So, scramble for Africa. In the early 1880s, a local revolt threatened European use of the Suez Canal. So, the Egyptians wanted to take over the Suez Canal. So, this gave the British an excuse to go in and take over the thing completely. So, this canal was completed by the French engineers in 1869, and it was the shortest route from Europe to East Africa, India, and East Asia. It's a big deal. So, this is the trip through the Suez Canal. Without it, you go all the way around Africa. So, it became the lifeline between Britain and its colony of India, and the British quickly moved to put down the revolt and take over Egypt completely. And then next, the British went in and took over Sudan, which was right next to Egypt. Other powers like France, Italy, Germany, and Belgium eyed British actions jealously, and they wanted parts of Africa for themselves. So, a little revolt near the Suez Canal causes this big opening and kind of the takeover of Africa. What you had in Africa was diamonds, gold, and other valuable resources, which were discovered in Africa in the late 19th century. So, here's a picture of the Suez Canal. This is why it's so important right here. It's an extreme shortcut compared to going around. Different resources of Africa, a lot of oil today. And here's the Suez Canal today. So cut straight out of the desert. So in 1884, at the Berlin Conference in Germany, Bismarck, which we've talked about a lot, okay, and other European leaders divided up the remaining parts of Africa. So they just said, okay, this is the part you're going to get, this is the part we're going to get, things like that. So by 1890, only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. Major imperial powers. So the major European powers with colonies in Africa were Great Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy. The French acquired much of Central Africa and Northwest Africa above the Sahara. And one of the worst ones was King Leopold II of Belgium ruled Congo in the center of Africa as his own private state. So it wasn't a colony, it wasn't owned by Belgium, it was owned by him. He treated the natives harshly, killing millions to increase the production of his rubber plants. And there's even worse stories, chopping off hands and feet if they tried to escape, and just unbelievable things that they did to the native people. The British established colonies in West Africa and along almost the entire length of East Africa from Egypt all the way down to South Africa, which you see here. So here's Egypt, here's South Africa. The British kind of controlled this whole area coming all the way down. And Cecil Rhodes, which you see here on the left, a leading British imperialist, planned to build a railroad all the way down the eastern side of Africa from Cairo all the way to Egypt, from Cairo in Egypt to Cape Town, South Africa. Germany took Tanzania, Cameroon, Togo, and Southwest Africa. So the legacy of imperialism in Africa, what happened after the Europeans got there? Before the arrival of European imperialists, boundaries in Africa were loosely defined. So they would, kind of like in the United States when we had the Plains Indians that would move from different places, different seasons. That's kind of how it was in Africa. So they reflected territories inhabited and controlled by different ethnic or tribal groups. And what in their scramble for Africa, what the European powers did is they didn't pay any attention to any of these boundaries. So, whenever possible, they established mining operations or they cultivated cash crops to be sold to Europe. Native Africans were used as a cheap labor force, just like they were in India. And Europeans also introduced advanced Western technology and ideas. So, some of the positive and negative effects on Africa of imperialism. Positive effects: European medicines improve nutrition, increase lifespan of Africans, but you always have the flip side of that. That leads to a population explosion. Europeans introduced modern transportation and communications such as telegraph, railroads, and telephones. A small minority of Africans received improved education and greater economic opportunities, and some served as the administrators in the army. So the negative effects: European domination led to the erosion of traditional African values and destroyed many existing social relationships. So it kind of just wiped out their culture. African people were treated as inferior to Europeans. Native people were forced to work long hours for low pay under horrible conditions. So they just transferred all the problems that they had in Europe with the Industrial Revolution to these places that they take over and just use them for labor. And Europeans divided Africa artificially. They ignored tribal, ethnic, and cultural boundaries, and this led to what we still have today: a lot of conflicts in Africa because you made a country out of three tribes that don't like each other.